Kick-Ass is one of those comic book movies that has gotten a lot of mixed response. Most people really like it and understand what it's trying to be. Others hate it and think the film suffers from identity crisis. I fucking love it personally. I saw it as soon as it came out, pre-ordered it as soon as I could, and not only own it on DVD but also on Blu-ray. I've seen it dozens of times and for me it just gets better each time. Kick-Ass instantly became one of my all-time favourite movies. Am I saying it's perfect and flawless? Well, no, it has its flaws like pretty much every movie, but I think for each cons the film has, there are at least a dozen pros. The plot surrounds Dave Lazowski, played by Aaron Johnson, a comic book geek who asks that question that many of us have asked: why has no one ever tried to become a superhero? He orders a wetsuit and goes around under the name of Kick-Ass. After a failed crime-stopping ends in him getting stabbed and hit by a car, he has metal plates put inside his body. And then after that he goes back out to carry on crime fighting. Now he can't really feel much pain. He goes off and saves a guy who's being beaten up. The people who were standing there actually filmed the fight on their phones and then put them on the internet, resulting in it becoming the most viewed video ever. This attracts the attention of Big Daddy, played by Nick Cage, and Hit Girl, played by Chloe Moretz, in the role that essentially made her the biggest rising star in Hollywood today. They are a father and daughter pair who themselves are trying to take out a mob boss called Frank D'Amico, who's played by Mark Strong, in revenge for framing Big Daddy as a drug dealer and making his wife commit suicide, just barely allowing her to give birth to Hit Girl. Kick-Ass is asked to tell a guy to leave a girl alone that he likes himself. Hit Girl comes in because the men in the apartment actually work for Frank D'Amico. Hit Girl kills them all, and Frank D'Amico believes the murders to have been committed by Kick-Ass due to a picture of him being found on one of the men's phones before they died. For the rest of the movie, Frank is basically trying to kill Kick-Ass with the help of his son Chris D'Amico, who's played by Christopher Mintz-Plaza, who becomes Red Mist later on in the film. Kick-Ass is a film for me that just gets better each time I watch it. I think it blends action together with comedy really well, and despite the fact that a lot of people say it suffers from an identity crisis, I think I really do know what it wants to be. The first hour is a lot more funny and light-hearted because Dave's out there trying to have fun. Whenever the film gets dark and violent, that's when for Dave everything just becomes really real. The second half especially is Dave realising that becoming a superhero is not all fun and games as he thought it was in the first half of the film. Kick-Ass is a strong representation of what would happen if people really tried to become superheroes. It has the realism of something like the Dark Knight trilogy and takes away all the money and gadgets that Bruce Wayne has. It shows what would happen if a real comic book fan with no money, training, or anything tried to become a superhero, and I think this film really does do a good job with showing this. The acting has got to be some of the best in a comic book movie in the last few years. Of course, the show stealer is Chloe Moretz, who I swear in the next 10 years is going to win an Oscar. Hit Girl instantly became my favourite character in the film, which is probably why I absolutely love the Hit Girl comic series. The action scenes are really well done and extremely violent. In fact, I'm surprised the film has a rating of a 15 because at times the film can be really gory. Nick Cage is actually pretty good in the role of Big Daddy. He has an Adam West Batman type of voice for most of the film, which I think he actually did really well. Although at times his overacting can be quite funny, it's nowhere near as bad as something like The Wicker Man. Aaron Johnson gives probably the most convincing American accent I'd ever heard from a British accent, and that includes Mark Strong, who also does an amazing American accent in this film. Kick-Ass is as fun as it is violent, as dark as it is entertaining. To me, it's one of those just perfect superhero movies. A lot of fans of the comics have kind of complained about a load of the changes that they made to the comics. Well, actually, the script was being written before the comics had even been finished. I think most of the changes they made kind of worked better than they did in the comics. Spoilers right now, by the way. If you haven't seen the film or read the comics, click the annotation on the screen to skip to when the spoilers have finished. Towards the end of the film, there's a scene where Kick-Ass and Big Daddy are captured and start being tortured. This scene gives me goosebumps every time I watch it, and I've seen it dozens of times, so when I feel it every time I watch the film, you know it's doing something right. In the original comics, before Big Daddy is killed, he reveals who he is, and that him and Hit Girl are only actually going after the mob boss because they needed a villain. He actually takes Hit Girl away from her mother and trains her up because he wanted to be a superhero, as he is a big comic fan. He also wanted her to have an exciting life instead of sitting around watching American Idol all the time. In fact, to get money for all his equipment, he sells a bunch of his vintage comics. In the film, they pretty much scrap all of this, and I definitely think in some ways it was a good idea. Sure, it worked in the comics, but I think with the different routes they took with the film, it would not have worked as well that way. But, of course, it does create a big plot hole, which is, how the fuck did Big Daddy get all that money? If he was an ex-cop and got busted for drug dealing, wouldn't he basically have no money at all? The only thing I think that would justify this is if he had like savings in a special account that he kept, or if he sold vintage comics like he did in the original comic. But still, that's the only real problem I had with this film. I actually preferred the film over the comic for some reason. It may be because I saw the film first, or maybe the film is just all round better. Kick-Ass is still one of my favourites, if not my favourite comic book / superhero movie of all time. Despite the somewhat low box office takings, it luckily made enough money for a sequel to be made, which is of course being released this week. In the UK it just came out today, but in the US it's out on Friday. It has had a huge cult following on DVD and Blu-ray, and fingers crossed that not only Kick-Ass 2 is good, but it makes enough money for the third and final chapter to be made in a few years' time. Kick-Ass is action-packed, funny, has some great performances, and is truly unforgettable. I give it a 5 out of 5.